On behalf of the 210 Footwear Foundation, Women in the Footwear Industry, and the ALDO Group, I am honored to present Sandrine Devillard. Sandrine is a senior partner at McKinsey Montreal and a globally recognized subject matter expert on diversity in the workplace. Sandrine is the practice leader for McKinsey's consumer and retail sector, having provided clients with her expertise for more than 25 years. About 10 years ago, Sandrine initiated McKinsey's Women Matter research program, which focuses on the role of women in business. McKinsey has been researching to build the case for greater parity in the economy and in corporations. We're very excited to have Sandrine with us here today to discuss this very important topic and address gender diversity in the workplace. We will also have time at the end to address some questions that were submitted to us by the Wi-Fi network from across the country. And with that, please join me in welcoming Sandrine.
Good morning. I'm Sandrine Devillard. I'm senior partner at McKinsey & Company, and I'm based in Montreal. I'm honored and delighted to get the opportunity to introduce you to over 10 years of research that we've been conducting on the topic of gender diversity and diversity at large. Now, you may wonder what has McKinsey to do with this topic. We actually started researching the topic more than 20 years ago. We started doing it for ourselves. We wanted to attract, develop, and retain the best talent, meaning also the women, and we were not satisfied where we were. And I was personally in charge of what we called at the time of gender diversity for the Paris office, and we had lots of progress, and then I was promoted in charge of the European one and then the global one. And in this capacity as the leader of our women initiative, I got the opportunity to attend many fora were amazing. I could meet amazing women and also amazing men, because it did require to be an amazing man to dare to attend those meetings 20 years ago. And each time I came back with very mixed feelings. On the one hand, I was very excited to get the opportunity to meet those amazing talent. On the other hand, I felt that it was a little bit content free. As I was coming back from one of those fora, I asked myself, does it really make sense? Does it really make sense to have more women on top of corporations? Does it make sense for the company's performance? Does it make sense for their competitiveness? And it's obviously a set of very hard questions to answer. But as I came back from one of those trips, we decided to research the topic. And the way we did it is, in the perfect world, what we'd like to do is we'd like to have, let's take a set of companies with no women at the top. Let's inject women. Let's see if the results improve, everything being equal. We all know this is not possible to do. So the way we did it is that we tried to approach this tough topic using different angles. And you'd be glad to know that we found out that it does make sense. Women do matter. As an anecdote, as I was midway through the research, I happened to bump into one of our senior leaders at the firm, managing director at the time, and he was very supportive of the cause. And as I was telling him what we were trying to do, he had two immediate reactions. Number one, he said, "This is fantastic, we should definitely research the topic." And then he paused and he said, "My goodness, what are we going to do if you find out that women have a negative impact?" So I said, with this in mind, let's research. So as I was telling you, we've been researching the topic for now over 12 years in the series of Women Matter reports that looked at gender diversity in corporations, but we also enlarged, looking at the power of parity, that looks at what is the gender equality at large, not only in the corporate world. And we also expanded to diversity matter, which is, diversity at large. Does it bring results? With the McKinsey Global Institute, we surveyed 95 countries that represent over 98% of the world population. And we tried to identify, how we were standing on diversity at large. We looked at 15 gender equality indicators grouped into 4 categories, like work, like essential services and enabler of economic opportunity, like legal protection and political voice, and physical security and autonomy. Let me dig into some of them. For gender equality at work, did you know that 655 million fewer women than men are in the labor force? And that 3 times more hours are spent by women versus men on unpaid care work throughout the world. It also varies a lot by countries. On essential services and enablers of economic opportunity, We have 240,000 women who die every year due to pregnancy complication, and 195 million fewer women than men are literate. On the legal protection and political voice, 20% of women in ministerial and parliament roles for every 100 men. 18 out of 90 countries analyzed have unequal inheritance rights between sons and daughters. And last but not least, on the physical security and autonomy, 1.5 million of girls are missing every year due to sex-selective abortion. And 1 in 3 women has experienced intimate partner violence. So with this in mind, we created what we call a GPS, Global Parity Score. A GPS of 1 would mean that we have perfect equality between men and women on those 15 indicators. And we analyzed all those 90 plus countries around the world. And what we found out is that we are living in a world of inequalities, where the most, I would say, basic rights are being denied for many, many women throughout the world. Have a look at this map, I am blessed, I'm French, as you can hear, and I'm blessed that I'm coming from a part of the world where the gender parity score is 0.71. Still quite far away from 1, by the way. And now I'm living, in Canada. Canada, North America, Oceania, 1.74. However, focus, on the red dots. India, 0.48. Middle East and Africa, 0.48. Southeast Asia, 0.44. This world is a very unequal place, and women still need, to fight with men to have the same right as women. This is a little bit of an eye chart, just colorful, but let's double click, on the G7, which are countries in which, we were the closest to the gender parity of 1. And you can see that, okay, we're green in terms of maternal mortality, we're green in terms of digital inclusion, we're almost there in terms of sex ratio at birth. Actually, we have more women than men. So, but look at the red columns, We still have strong concentration of inequality in Europe and in the G7 in terms of wage gap, leadership, unpaid care work, and legal protection, political representation, and violence to women. That's a lot. There are obvious ethical reasons why we should close the gender inequality gap. There are also economical reasons. And I'm sparing you the detail, and you can find all of this in our report, Power of Parity, produced by the McKinsey Global Institute. But we calculated that if we were to close a little bit the gender gap in terms of unpaid care work, number of hours worked by women, and the field in which women are operating, we are talking about adding $12 trillion to the world economy. That means actually increasing the GDP by 1 percentage point overall. It is massive. So beyond ethical reason, there is a true case for change, which is that we need to closing the gender gap. If you look now at the micro level, and this is an analysis we just finished for the US, we are the same for many, many countries throughout the world. But you will find out that we still have, at the level of corporation, a very leaky pipeline. If you look here at the case of the US, you will see that we are among the companies we researched, and we researched hundreds of companies in lots of detail. You have 48% of women entering the companies, and then it goes down and down and down, all the way to only 22% of women in the C-suite. So lots of attrition. If you put on top of that, you add a lens, which is a lens of diversity at large. And here we have one example, which is, we're comparing women of color, men of color, etc. You can see that it's like double penalty when you're starting at more than 1 degree of diversity. So if you're a woman, you're already penalized. If you're a woman of color, you're extremely penalized. Compare, the women of color, they start at 17%, which is extremely low, all the way down to 4%. The attrition rate is extremely high. Much higher than the men of color, actually. 16%, all the way down to 9%. In Canada, and this is very typical of many, many countries, for instance, in Europe, France, UK, you can see that, again, the corporate pipeline is extremely leaky, and you have 2 choke points. The first one is, the first level of managerial position. Women are 30% less likely to be promoted from entry level to manager. The second choke point is from director to vice president. Women here are 60% less likely to be promoted from directors to vice president. So, people are talking a lot about, there's a glass ceiling. I would like to say, no, there's no such thing as a glass ceiling. There are just many, many series of very thick layers of men. So, what is the micro case for change? We clearly demonstrated that companies which were the more gender diverse at the top were also the most profitable if you compare them to their industry. We've demonstrated this when we've done our first Women Matter report 12 years ago, and since then, lots of people have copied us and have done all kinds of analysis and always, except in 2 instances, demonstrated the same. We also recently, in our diversity matter, demonstrated that actually ethnic diversity in the countries in which you can report ethnic diversity, which wouldn't be the case where I'm coming from, and in most EU countries, it's completely illegal, but ethnic diversity, as we researched it in Canada, South Africa, US, UK, and 4 other countries that I'm forgetting, has also a big premium. So there's a clear case that says, that the more diverse companies are, the most performant they are. This being said, don't get me wrong, we're not talking about causality. We're talking about a positive correlation, and we all know that correlation doesn't prove causality. But, we could have demonstrated that there was no causality, no correlation whatsoever. This is not what we demonstrated. We demonstrated a very statistically valid causality between diversity and gender diversity at the top and companies' performance. The next question is, where can this come from? And we found out a number of elements where this could be coming from. Number one, companies which are able to attract, develop, and retain the most volatile talent, the women talent, are able to attract, develop, and retain the best talent, and as a result are more profitable. But as I was doing, I've done thousands of interviews, I kept on hearing always the same thing, which was, when you have more than one woman in the room, something is happening. People were also saying, when you have only one woman in the room, this is not gender diversity, because each time this person speaks, she's like the woman. When you have more than one, when she speaks, it's more like she's the CFO, she's the head of communication, she's the CHRO. So with this in mind, we said, and people were saying there's something around leadership style. So we looked at the literature and we identified that the most acclaimed researchers were Avolio, Igli, and Bath. What they have done is that they have a very, very big database of 7,000 managers throughout the world, and they have surveyed for many years those managers, and they have identified what were the leadership traits. And what they found out is fascinating. Number one, they found out, surprise, surprise, that on average, women and men are different. Meaning that out of the 9 positive leadership styles, women tend to apply much more some leadership style than men. Women tend to apply much more people development, expectation and reward, role modeling. Men tend to apply much more control and corrective action, individualistic decision making. Don't get me wrong. We're not saying that, people development is more effective than control and corrective action. We're not saying either that men do not apply people development or expectation and reward. The only thing that we're saying is that if you look at those 9 positive leadership styles, on average, women tend to focus on 2, and women tend to apply much more frequently the other one. Why is this important? We clearly demonstrated that there was a link between applying diversity of leadership style and performance. On top of that, we surveyed, hundreds of top executives around the world, and we asked them, to meet the future challenges that your company will face, what are the most important leadership styles that you would like to see in action? And we had done lots of, focus group before that. And what they said, and you see here the percentage, they said, number one is intellectual stimulation. The world is getting much more complex. We want people and top managers to be able to grasp this complexity and to stimulate the employees so that, we reach the best answer. This is a leadership style which is equally applied by both men and women. But all the other ones that they mentioned as inspiration, participative decision-making, expectations and reward, people development, role modeling, all of those leadership styles that they would like to see applied more often are leadership styles which are most frequently used by women. So somehow we demonstrated that it's not so much a call for diversity, or it's not so much a call for gender diversity. It is much more a call for diversity of leadership styles. That can be brought by women on average, but that can also be brought by men. So that's why, when people said, had Lehman Brothers been Lehman sisters, it wouldn't have failed. This is BS, excuse my French, because I believe that had Lehman Brothers been Lehman Brothers and sisters, maybe it would not have failed. So, where are we in terms of action? The good news is that the case for change starts to be understood. This is an example for Canada. What do you think is the primary reason your company prioritizing workforce diversity? When you look at the level of senior vice president and C-suite, 60% of them said because it leads to better business results. However, when you go, at the field employee level, entry level, managers, etc., this is not what people say, number one. They say number one because it's fair to all people and because it contributes to a positive image of the company. Meaning that the case for change, while understood at the top level of corporation, is not understood through the company. So the business case for change, both at the macro level and at the micro level, has been demonstrated over and over. But is this understood? Okay, good news and bad news. And this is an example for Canada, but it's very much in line with the rest of the Western world. If you look at the far right column, senior vice president and C-suite, this is how they answer to the question, what do you think is the primary reason your company prioritizing workforce diversity? 62% of them said it's because it leads to better business results, meaning that they are fully understood, the case for change in terms of economic value creation. However, if you look at field employee, entry level, managers, etc., they mention that it's because it's fair to all people and it contributes to a positive image of the company. Which is all true, but it means that the fact that gender diversity and diversity at large is also good for the competitiveness of company and their performance is not widely understood. And then it can come as something that you do, on top, if you have time, when the conditions are met, as opposed to something that you need to do all the time. So, why is not the situation changing? Because I showed you the funnel, and unfortunately, whether in North America, in Europe, or in Asia and Africa, change is way too slow to happen. We've been doing this now over 12 years, and we can see that it's very, very incremental. Because there are lots of barriers. What are they? Obviously, there are barriers at the level of society, at the level of corporations, but also within men and women. Let me go on, the ambition gap and the confidence gap. What you have here is what the percentage of men and women willing to be promoted. What you can see is that the delta between the blue, the men, and the orange, the women, is kind of limited, meaning that women are ambitious. They aspire to go to the top. However, when you look at the right-hand side, if you focus on, I want to become a top executive, you look at the percentage of people who want to be a top executive and believe it is likely they will become one. You can see a 10% difference, a 10% gap between women who say that they are confident and men who say that they are confident. And we've been hearing a lot about the fact that women lack self-confidence, women lack self-confidence. And let me qualify a little bit this assertion. It is partially true. What we've demonstrated is that women were more and more confident depending on how conducive they felt that the environment was for gender diversity. So in a nutshell, it is not so much, their confidence in their ability to succeed. It is much more, is this environment supportive to diversity? Meaning, is this environment supportive of difference in leadership style? Is this environment supportive of different ways of working? Is this environment supportive of ramp down, ramp on? Is this environment supporting of discontinuity in the career, so on and so forth? So, it's not only a question of that women need to work on themselves to build more this and that. It's also, organizations need to evolve in order to be much more inclusive. So what do we do? People are always asking me, Sandrine, what is the silver bullet? And unfortunately, what we found out is that, like many things in life, there is no such thing as a silver bullet. For change to happen, you need to implement a full ecosystem, and you need to do this consistently over the years. What are we talking about when we say ecosystem? First and foremost, what you need to have is you need to have CEO commitment. You need this to be gender diversity and diversity to be a priority at the top. The CEO and the executive suite must personally monitor the progress of gender diversity, and this must be communicated. If you do not have this in place, all the rest is poetry. Number two, what you need to have is that you need to have transparency and key performance indicators. When we ask companies, do you have indicators? They always say, yes, we do. When you look into the detail, you find out that the numbers of indicators that they're monitoring is very limited. Do you monitor, what the percentage of women in your talent pool? Do you monitor if you're hiring a percentage of women which is in line with the percentage of women you have in your talent pool? Do you monitor, business unit by business unit, countries by countries, at the intersection of business units and countries, what the percentage of women at each step of the progression compared to men? Do you know what the reason behind the attrition? This is very seldom done. So having transparency and key performance indicator is very crucial. Then you need to have two things in place. On the one hand, you need to develop women's leadership. It's a combination of training, coaching, sponsorship and mentorship, and also having a women network. You also need to have what we call diversity enabling structure, meaning flexible work structure, extended leave policy, back to work program. And last but not least, you need to have inclusive mindset and inclusive environment. What does it mean? It means that the environment should be conducive to diversity, but also that you need to look at all your human resources processes and ensure that they are 100% gender neutral. You will be surprised to realize how very often they are gender biased. So for instance, let me just give you one example. In many companies, people tend to confuse the difference in leadership styles with the lack of leadership style by women. So as you can see, it's not going to happen immediately. It's going to take time and commitment over the year to make change happen. What's very important also is to say, the most up-to-date companies in terms of diversity and inclusion, they make this topic a priority. And they really go from, what's diversity? Diversity is really who our workforce represents. And a way to say it is that who is being invited at the party? Do we invite everybody at the party? But inclusion, goes way beyond. Inclusion is about how we make them feel. So it's not like who is invited at the party, it's who is invited to dance. And the best performing company, they take this approach. And they go from, diversity is the right thing to do, to diversity because it's the right thing to do, and because it is a catalyst of inclusive growth and long-term value creation. Best performing company goes from, representation makes a difference, to a sense of belonging and inclusion will strengthen the virtuous circle of diversity. Companies which are best performing, they go from increasing the representation of women, LGBTQ+, workers, ethnic minority at the highest level, to increasing the representation of those populations in decisional roles, and also complementing an inclusive corporate culture. And last but not least, companies which are well performing, they go from a universal formula to a personalized formula that goes well in each of the BUs in each of the countries. Number one, diversity does matter, both gender diversity and diversity at large. Number two, change will not happen by itself. Progress right now is extremely incremental. Number three, diversity can be achieved if we take action now, because women matter, you do matter. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sandrine, for that presentation. It was amazing and very enlightening. I want to thank you on behalf of the Wi-Fi Network for taking the time today. Speaking of the Wi-Fi Network, we received questions from the 4,000 women part of the network, a few questions that I have the privilege of asking you today.
Thank you.
So let's get to it. First question. You spoke of how adding another level of diversity affects women throughout the pipeline. What are your thoughts on adding age to that pipeline?
Yeah, and unfortunately, Tanya, it doesn't help. So the more level of diversity that you're adding, the more it's preventing you from progressing into the funnel. And age is one of that. There are companies which, when they have a diversity program, tackle in particular age group. And it can be, I've seen both, actually. I've seen companies wanted to rejuvenate and tackling, the younger generation, the millennia, the Gen Z. But I've also seen companies, trying to ensure that they were able, to really capture the wealth of experience and expertise provided by the people more senior, and trying to do something to ensure that they could still develop and be successful in companies. But I would say that by and large, it's not on the number one list of priority when we're talking about diversity.
That's very interesting. Another really interesting question that we got was around the idea of companies really focusing their energy on female leadership with executives. What are your thoughts on, or maybe in your research you've seen, but the efforts that are done to support female inventors or creators?
It's a very good question, and indeed we've seen that there are lots of inequalities in the corporate world, but I must say that in the world of investments, the situation is even worse. We've done in-depth analysis in Canada, in the US, in UK on this particular topic. All of this accessible on our site, and we found that there are lots of barriers for women to get access to capital. And right now, when you look at the share of women entrepreneurs, you can see that it's lagging even further behind than women in corporations.
Now, I'm sure throughout your research, you've studied many countries,
Yep.
All over the world. What countries get it right? Who are the leaders in female leadership?
Yeah. So these are two different questions, because what countries are getting it right? The answer is like zero. Because as we've seen, even in Canada, Australia, US, France, and in Scandinavian countries, there are still a lot of gap between men and women on many dimensions. Which are the countries leading the charge? I would say the Scandinavian countries. If you look at the various indicators, these are the countries which are the closest in terms of fully closing the gender gap. Because within Europe in itself, you have large differences between Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, Central Europe, and the Scandinavian countries. So the countries which are getting this right are more like Sweden and Norway.
You mentioned in your presentation that, throughout your research, there are certain countries, obviously, where you can't track ethnicity, you can't track religion, you can't track the different types of diversities. What are your thoughts with countries and companies that are tracking quota or using quotas as a method to, bring up the numbers in diversity and in female leadership?
Mm-hmm. So I do believe that, for change to happen, you need to consider the topic of diversity and gender diversity like a change program. And no company, will embark into a change program without defining, what's my aspiration? Mm-hmm. What target do I want to hit? So I do believe, I'm strongly convinced that in this topic, just like in many other, you need to do a diagnostic first, you need to understand what are your bottlenecks, but then you need to set for yourself aspiration. So I don't think it's quotas, but I think it's aspiration. You should say, if we're able, should we aspire to close the gap in terms of recruiting between men and women by the year 2022? If so, how many women in tech will we have? Should we aspire to close the gap in terms of women advancement by 2024? If so, where it will bring us? And only the companies which have set for themselves aspiration and which have done, a very clear assessment of their starting point and which have formulated a list of actions to go from the starting point to their aspiration, only those companies make progress. So it is very important to have this. At the level of of countries, what we've seen in most of the countries now is that we have quotas. Maybe that's going to be your next question, so let me venture an answer. But we've seen that many countries have decided to implement quotas at the level of board and director. And we've done the analysis, and I can tell you that if you have quota at the level of board of director, it does lead to increase gender diversity at the board of director.
You're forcing
Period.
it.
Does this lead to better gender diversity at the level of the executive committee and further down the organization? Mm-hmm. We've made the analysis, and there's no correlation whatsoever.
It's interesting.
Food for thought.
Food for thought. So in your presentation, you mentioned the ecosystem, the full package on what companies need to really succeed and lead in diversity within their companies. What is your recommendation or your advice to companies that are maybe missing some of the ingredients to that recipe?
Indeed, I mean, unfortunately, there's no such thing as a silver bullet. You need the full package, but you need this recipe or those ingredients to be really tailored to your particular situation. And I would say that, you know, when and also it differs countries by countries. We surveyed a lot, many corporations, and for instance, IKEA, the type of measures that they implement in India has nothing to do with the measures for their business of retail, has nothing to do with the measures that they are implementing in Eastern Europe in their business of production, and nothing to do with the measures that they are implementing in North America for their logistic business whatsoever. So you need to implement, I would say, a recipe which is really tailored to the bottlenecks that you're facing.
So there's no one size fits all.
There's no one size fits all, and it depends, you know, companies by companies. So that's why I'm saying, you know, this is a real change program. Mm-hmm. And what we've seen very often is that some companies get it right. They have the right initiatives. However, they do not have the key success factor of a change program, meaning very often they're missing some what we call change agents. Mm-hmm. And we've seen, you know, that managers are not very convinced about gender diversity. So what do you do to ensure that the managers, men middle managers, are convinced and become advocate and become change agent? That would be a measure which are very seldom seen implemented. And when implemented, it can bring so much impact.
It's very interesting. Sandrine, time is up. You've answered our questions, but again, we want to thank you for this amazing presentation, and thank you for answering some of these questions from our viewers in the Wi-Fi network.